Another thing that I probably should have attended to in neatening up was, sort of my rant on trying to give a kind of historical description of the cultural residue that we have at the moment, and I try to make the point that people are not being imprinted by culture, that they are re-establishing this, let's say, cultural toxicity, and the vector is actually from women, from females, or something like that. And I mean, perhaps it's even regarded that patriarchy is something that is promulgated by women. That perhaps there are some ways of thinking about that within the Jungian thing, that it's not this passive recipient or something like that. But what I would just wanted to describe in terms of the actual, let's say, mechanism of how that actually happens in each generation is essentially there's a differential treatment of boys and girls, in that essentially boys are molded much more than women are. So, for example, what what causes the toxicity to be generated, for instance, is essentially differential treatment, in that um, uh, women are permitted effectively to reinvent the kind of the hy, hypergamous, sort of rudiments and dependent and sort of and stereotypes and things like that they are permitted to get away with that form of thinking. It's not sort of berated out of them. So women or girls are only really chastised when they're caught at breaking very strict, stark rules, and there are huge presumptions essentially against doubting that girls you sort of even cross those lines. So they see a very sort of rigid system where it's like, well, you can pretty much do a lot. You can get even quite close to the line as long as you don't appear to cross the line. That's the sort of the moral sort of code that sort of is the imprint of the rudiments of a hypergamous, kind of manipulation of society, and you can see almost that how that lends itself towards inculcating borderline personality sort of traits and values, and having and setting up a kind of system that can sort of burden its that can cope with dealing with those kinds of values, which can essentially just be concealed within the appearance of of supposedly doing it for the right intention or doing it for the right reason. All you have to do is have this very, very weak argument that, oh, I thought something else, oh, my intention or whatever. Whereas men or boys actually get their intentionality looked at under a microscope and berated. And the kind of criticism that boys essentially absorb is the somewhat the differential. And you can see this hypocrisy quite clearly even in the so-called enlightened feminists themselves, who their whole moral mentality is so hypocritical and poisonous. It's so unprincipled. It's purely based on balancing this narrative that they're projecting onto people, essentially, and they are essentially the next generation of the same bullshit, effectively the same toxic board. I mean, perhaps it was perhaps more contained within the traditional confines that essentially women can operate these strategies, they can do these things, but they don't get to sort of promulgate them with a kind of robust, forthright voice, that they're not allowed to voice and advocate policy and politics and rules to sort of to facilitate those strategies. That as soon as you give women that voice to essentially try to essentially corrode um, you know structures that are needed in order to sort of maintain any kind of coherent consistency, that when then you've got this kind of very pernicious sort of corrosive anti it doesn't even have internal consistency anymore, and that's why, for example, identity politics is just so poisonous, in that it ends up even creating its own sort of like little ethno safe spaces within itself, because they're so abrasive against one another, as the sort of the feminist, sort of tendency sort of is, that it's hard for them to even compromise that, how do you extract an even amount of exploitation of male disposability and male, sort of utility that is owed to them because of the dogma of this narrative, of this historical projection which is put onto people. But anyway, let's just look at it in the microcosm of how this works within the reinvention of it in one generation. So you have boys and girls in school, let's just say, or something like that. So I mean, you can see it along the edges in terms of that. Boys are berated and their intentionality is scrutinized essentially and criticized on such a level so as to actually develop. I mean, it's not as if there aren't borderline boys out there. There are boys with borderline personality disorder and traits and things like that, and they will usually react quite badly. They won't be able, they will create a whole kind of reactionary mentality, where they will just sort of, usually also within adolescence there is a phase where all sort of adolescents go through this, where they're almost testing out sort of the negative reactive mind frame. And usually they grow out of it. Usually they go into it, explore it, and then at some point they sort of reach an epiphany that, actually taking this sort of, this idea that I'm sort of just dealing with things that are being imposed on me, and I'm not sort of, trying to right the ship and sort of try to make my own enterprise out of it or make my own project out of it. If you don't have that leading sort of mentality that essentially there's no one to save you, whereas women don't have that source of independence because essentially, they're used to essentially just taking the easy route of levying those constraints against or those worries and concerns against someone that panders to them, and there is, let's say, because of the asymmetry between the biological sexes, there is like an evolutionary explanation for this, or a reason for this, which is that essentially women have an imperative to actually establish a functional family earlier in life, because the actual progeny will be healthier if they have children at a younger age, essentially. Whereas a man can sire children biologically perfectly healthy much later in life. So essentially, women are predisposed to targeting men that are already established, already have social status, already have some sort of power in the community or something like that. They get to access that quite. It's in within the realm of sexual competition. It's quite a valid strategy for women to target such men. So, whereas for men, especially younger men, the converse is basically true, that they're going to be overlooked until they're established. So there's a huge differential. Whereas like women have this sort of innate biological value, which then obviously dissipates over the medium and long term, and men essentially appreciate over the long term if they are actually successful at being competent and being able to amass something that they can effectively tender and offer to the woman, and sort of in the hypergamous kind of dynamic. And women have just completely normalized this instead of looking at the inequality, the inherent inequality in this dynamic. They just accept it as part of reality, and yet they still want an equal share that's measured out to them throughout their entire existence. Essentially, they want the hypergamous preference that society sort of has ceded to them, and they want it measured out to them throughout the course of their lives. So it's quite a disgusting rationalization, essentially, and ideological inculcation of female privilege that is just sort of taken to be normal or something like that, and they don't realize that all these things that they complain about men for are things that effectively they have demanded men do in order to win favor with them, and it is just simply that they think that that sort of cultural structure is something that is the starting point, and they need to get an improved situation from there, rather than understanding the inflation of their of the gender disparity, the inflation of their extraction and their exploitation of the system. So it's exactly like Agent Smith in the Matrix complaining. He's the enforcement agent, and he's complaining about the whole fucking situation. It's like there he is, effectively the enforcement of a parasitic kind of organization and system that is woven into the system, and it feels sorry for itself, and it's sort of it's resentful, and yeah, I mean, a lot of feminists, they're not even at that level of awareness, I would say, as well. But as the Agent Smith sort of, but I mean, yeah, I think I've made a case many times that essentially Agent Smith is the sort of the pinnacle sort of representation of the intellectual coherence or of the intellectual argument that exists within third wave feminism. So he's the sort of the actually sort of express rationalized third wave proponent of third wave feminism. Okay, let me find my bearings here. So effectively, out of a certain laxness which the culture preferentially offers to women, they are given essentially the space where they aren't criticized out of it. They aren't criticized out of their toxic knowledge system. So in terms of how they start making meaning of things, how they start generating beliefs about types and about gender and about biological sex and about sexual relations, and when I say that, I mean the relations between the two sexes and things like that. And you can also you can, in some sense, you can sympathize with it from an evolutionary point of view, because but I mean, I've made lots of recordings about this, about exactly how it's toxic, because essentially women that generate this kind of interface with society and the opposite sex, they're very hollow people. Essentially they're running a kind of a borderline personality program, even if they aren't necessarily borderline, but they've completely rationalized it, where essentially they what is it? Yeah, so it's like everything becomes a kind of statistical generalized model. And essentially the problem is that they can only measure the kind of the differential cost of every decision that they make. So it's like, and different decisions have different sort of statistical profiles in terms of like benefits and cost, and so they could go out to a very expensive nightclub and try to find a celebrity that will fall in love with them or something like that they'll be able to chase them and extract something from them or something like that. They'll be able to, maybe there are other things to do, like trying to climb a kind of social status hierarchy which has sort of instituted itself as a real thing in a particular sphere, in a particular sort of subculture or something like that. There are different forms of status that can be used to trade up on and used to sort of maximize, um, you know, what what have been called orbiters and such. And I mean there are gradations of orbiter, essentially as well. Um, and even women that are not capable of orchestrating that kind of interface with the opposite sex see the woman that can do that to some degree at least, and they know that it's an option, and then that is even the cause of resentment, even if that isn't the strategy that each individual woman uses. They feel left out of that, and so you almost the unsuccessful hypergamous woman is probably perhaps one of the most toxic elements, because they have a record of these stratagems imprinted and encoded into all of their relations, even though they don't act out the strategies. They calculate the cost of what they're missing out on, which is always a hypothetical because it's based on statistics. Like, even a woman who's at the top of her game, she can only end up with one man, essentially. And she doesn't even know what his fortune might bring, like maybe he'll be in the 1% and then he'll lose all of his money, So there's a lot of insecurity that cannot be calculated. And essentially, there's no way to win the game, essentially. Because you always have to settle with one or whatever, and whatever you have is going to be essentially, you can never be. I'm not describing this perfectly, but your confidence essentially is based on a statistic, which means that essentially, if you had just been a little bit more risky, you could have won something a bit better or something like that, and so essentially when you choose to devote time to a particular place at which there are certain amounts of men that you might be able to extract things from, you're always comparing that against a different place that you could have gone to instead, and what you might have been able to draw from that circle, So it has an inherent sort of corrosive perspective that cannot be squared, and essentially they want to use the same strategy, but they want to find a way to even it out. They want the state to be the hypergamous, the thing that is exploited to their benefit, because it's just owed to them because of some kind of historical whining and complaining and narrative and mythologized, sort of sob story about oppression, which is funny because essentially then they oppress themselves with this ideological bullshit, which makes them completely pathetic. I mean, these people have no integrity. They are, even if they are not borderline personality disordered themselves, they are effectively doing the behavior, so they end up essentially generating those values and generating those temperaments and such, and they are insufferable people. They have the vacuous, narcissistic scum. And they have no depth, and then what's left to them is obviously to join some kind of ideological echo chamber that feeds them, the dogmatic bullshit that tells them that they're certain and correct in their certitude about their generalizations that they project and such. Okay, so, and essentially this is because, well, I mean, perhaps things have changed as well. Now men essentially are given the same, boys of this generation, and I'm kind of imagining this because I don't really see how teachers interact with children. I actually know some of the personalities of some teachers, and it scares the fuck out of me because of this ideological bullshit, that you have these sorts of feminist monsters inculcating whatever bullshit they in children. So it's interesting because I think that children can be intelligent enough that they can see through the hypocrisy, because it is such a brittle thing that I think that there will be a reaction to it, that the upcoming generation will have it's as any generation will have, you know, many people that will fall for whatever the mainstream is, but I think there will be a large contingent of enlightened people that will have experienced this firsthand, that will have experienced the hypocrisy, that there will be little girls that see this very clearly delineated feminist toxicity that was offered to them, and they won't take it, and they will have rejected it, and they will have discovered the humanist sentiment inside of them, and then there will be boys as well who will, because I do think that boys are being offered the same kind of permissiveness, that they can be as critical as they want, as long as it's critical against the scapegoat, and then in as much as how they match up with that scapegoat, they'll realize that it's an arbitrary. So in some sense, boys will have a greater opportunity to see the mismatch, because it'll be levied against them by the girls, essentially. You know, this ideology, they will be the recipients of the toxicity, so they'll probably have more opportunity to see the internal contradiction, to see the inconsistency, and to see how the lack of integrity that authority takes in the teacher that is teaching this kind of bullshit and unable to rationalize it, and unable to square the circles and such. So I think in a microcosm, you know, there will be a good amount of people. I mean, and I mean this proportionally. The problem is that the mainstream is just so crazy. The mainstream is so drunk on this fascistic worldview of categorizing people into these generalizations in order to maintain the borderline value system, the borderline personality disordered, you know, sort of valued system, and an insulated narcissism, which you see these, you know, they're almost like trolls, you know, that they will dress up in such a way as to be disruptive and provocative, and so that they will provoke you, they wish to provoke you so that they can lecture you. It's almost like it's like a trap. It's literally a way to fall into their booby trap, so that you can so that they can represent the matrix, the identity matrix, so that they can be the kind of the archangel of this dogma, orthodoxy, and they can be seen to be proselytizing it. So it's an excuse to inject themselves, to interject into getting into ranting and this pervasive narrative, you know. So they're trying to find a hook so that they can sort of feed their mantra into something else, because they can only feel like they're making progress when they're spreading the virus, when they're spreading the groupthink, and so they're trying to manufacture the opportunity to do so, and it's you know, it's very juvenile, you know, and this is essentially because it doesn't have any internal accounting for itself. It only has an external manifestation, essentially. That image has to be, you know, you have to see the sort of you have to see the people in marching along, goose stepping in their big rallies. You know, you have to see everyone giving the same prominence. You know, it is exactly the fascistic political sentiment and system. You know, they have to feel the one thing. You know, and they call this liberal. I guess, you know, I think enough of them have actually. I guess they just call themselves progressive, in the same form of progress that the Nazis were after, literally. And you can see as well, like how they even talk explicitly about, you know, their political dissidents, how they actually feel about dealing with their political dissidents. But yeah, it's all based on this very brittle sort of the Hydra, the caravan that I was talking about as an analogy, the caravan of these bandwagons, eventually, it turns into a kind of Hydra as well, in which they're vying also for which of the heads are going to sort of lead the caravan. But okay, anyway, that's not that important to extend that analogy. It is interesting as well because the fascists also leveraged female psychic energy in this exact same way. The actual fierce proponents of Nazi philosophy and Nazi allegiance were women, and that is something that is usually overlooked, but because you don't see it in the movies. Well, actually, you do actually see some good performances of female Nazis that actually showed just how much they believed it, that the woman, like the men, were dealing with these fragile mental things, whereas the women could feel the rightness of the movement, as it were, that they were a part of, that, and how much control it gave them, how much cultural control. They didn't have to deal with the political policy, but essentially, essentially it turns out to be the same thing. The same sort of fascistic thing is that women want secure status, and the easiest way to secure status and know that you're being able to sort of that you're in a stable system is to have a class of exploited people, essentially. And it's ironic that in the name of stopping all exploitation, we're going to use a historical narrative to promulgate a program which essentially is always trying to fix history reactively, and can be so hypnotized by that you can set up essentially a new system of a plutocratic, corrupt elite that can do whatever the fuck it wants as long as it says the right thing about identity, essentially. I mean, it is a dictator's wet dream. It's made for the kind of plutocracy which fascism always precipitates. And these are the intellectual, idiots that form part of its the pseudo intellectuals, that just love it because they're down with it in terms of their personality. They are, the kind of the borderline sort of because that's their solution of stabilizing integrity and dignity. Is that you have to set up a kind of dialectical thing to sort of so that you don't actually have to have certain answers to the big questions. You're just going to sort of lock it into a frozen narrative, and formulaic sort of reduction of justice that is indistinguishable from retributivism. Effectively, it's a vampire epistemology. And effectively, if it's not allowed to generalize and make generalization and rely on generalizations, the whole thing completely falls apart. So it uses these fudged entities, it uses the sociological analysis essentially to excuse itself. And obviously when it has to privilege the sociological level of interrogation of reality, you're not even dealing with any, I mean, this is the racist heart at work, when these generalizations are reality to you. I mean, you're a fascist. I mean, it's and when you're not allowed to interrogate the individuals of these identities, and when you are a proponent of the identity, when you are an activist for the identity, there is no humanity in that worldview. In the humanist sense, at least. I mean, you've given up all universal ways of bridging those things essentially, or at least your bridge is what is called some kind of equality, which is never going to be coherently borne out, because essentially you're using the same solution as apartheid, separate but equal. Is kind of like the fudging bullshit intellectualism, which is really, really ironic that that's where all of this is coming from, and how it has not been challenged or rooted out by you would have expected more, at least, from South African politics, but I guess when they switched to corruption and theft, at the convenience of this ideological scapegoating. Okay, let me just get back to this boys and girls thing. So effectively, when boys create strategies, they are berated for those strategies. They are interrogated. They are examined, at least. Women, on the other hand, or girls, you could say that they're also bullied in terms of creating conformances, because essentially the female strategy only works if there's no weak link in the chain, in that it operates as a block and therefore as a wedge. That has always generally been the source of female power within culture, is that they've been able to essentially conform to a trope or some kind of thematic thing in which there are very few weak links in the chain, because then they become a cultural stereotype, in some sense, that men are forced into putting into their thinking. So men then have to sort of put up with that standard. So if all women have the same standard, all men are forced to meet it, or at least are forced to factor it into their thinking. And women I think are still, you can see the rhetoric. They don't want to be individuals. They want to exert power as a block. And then there's this almost like female witchcraft, which is, well, how do we actually create a kind of a stable structure of our expectations, so as to force society to conform to those expectations and allow us to access the most. And traditional society essentially set up the same kind of transaction, but it tried to sort of stabilize it. It said, yes, we're going to give women all these nice extra things. They don't have to work. They don't have to do many things. They don't have to put up with certain concerns. And essentially that is so that at a younger age, they can have a stable situation in which they can be successful on the level of sexual competition. Again, you cannot forget the fact that monogamy in this age is very unnatural to our species. Generally speaking, all women that could bear children bared children successfully. Men did not. Only about, I think, half or a third of men actually fathered the next generation. So men have been disposable. They essentially didn't even earn the food that they ate. They had to provide some sort of value for it, whereas women were innately biologically valuable. And this differential essentially has driven effectively men to have to be competent and compete. And you can also see this biologically, whereas there are much more male idiots and male geniuses So there's obviously a selective pressure for men to be specialized and for men to create some kind of niche or value, or do something novel. I was going to bring this into the thing about Marxism and capitalism as well, in terms of the importance of innovation in sort of keeping the system turning over, in giving opportunity effectively for the structure to turn over and not just be a kind of residual sort of pool of inheritance. That there has to be some kind of in which the system itself is actually selecting for real value that can actually sustain the system, rather than just anyway, that's a complicated thing, because I'm trying to talk about say objectively better criteria. That has a pro-social effect, which some stricture within society is going to have issues allowing, just because of finding a bridge, and then perhaps some men can actually craft the bridge from here to there, and the men that can do that increase their status, and therefore they're able to garner women, essentially, or to have access to women, which otherwise would not be interested. That has been, in a generalized form, the kind of that men generate the value, and women are there to have it, to be the recipients of that value. And then, of course, there are also female geniuses, although there are less of them. And you can see that would be true because of just the selective pressures. That for a woman to have reproductive success, it's going to be less vital that they be a genius, whereas for a man it's actually going to perhaps make or break the difference, which is why effectively men have a greater imperative to achieve higher status, because it will actually impact them tremendously in terms of their opportunity of being able to find a mate. So I mean, if we look at these realities, we can see that a lot of the things that feminists complain about are quite ironic. It's quite sad, because women are the author of all of these things. Because even before monogamy, we lived in a very different landscape of sexual competition, and would be very interesting to think just how radically misshapen, or at least radically evolved or adapted or different values, or the shape of society that we have, if we lose the norm of monogamy. It will be interesting. But I mean, I don't see this sort of this third wave feminism, identity politics stuff. It doesn't really. I mean, it's so corrosive on every level. It's so unworkable. It's sort of it demands things on the basis that they are disruptive, and then when they actually don't perform as well, then they sort of just complain that they need to be even more disruptive. So it's just a kind of doom spiral. That's all they have behind them, is the same application of the same formulaic image thinking, which effectively only works when you have a scapegoat. to lay it all against. Yeah, so I mean, I think that we might have a very different culture if we just treated boys and girls the same. Um, because, or that would also force, let's say, identity politics to actually conform to, let's say, a coherent set of rules in which, there is actually a kind of internal coherency and consistency, which they're not, by definition, they're not capable of doing it, especially as feminism is, let's say, the loudest and was actually the initial contingent of this whole movement. And their whole strategy, which is effectively to sort of, sort of to take hostages, to slash and burn, to kind of be the sort of marauder, this marauding vanguard force of self-righteousness. It's basically a creed of irresponsibility, of pseudo-intellectuals pandering to people's sense of unaccountability and the idea that there should be a kind of paternalism, a fascistic paternalism as well, that feeds to people their narcissism and inflates their self-esteem with these group pride narratives of fixing history. And it's a never-ending circus, effectively, that is self-flagellating, and that self-flagellation is their excuse to continue, because it fails so badly, and they can essentially deposit that failure with their ideological enemy. They just say, well, this is proof that they're undermining us. This is, you can almost hear the echoes of the Jewish conspiracy in this kind of rhetoric and sophistry that they produce. And it's interesting because you can't actually uncover because they're not arguing from principles. They're arguing from these fudged entities to begin with. They're from these generalizations, which are fucking table thumped. They're just, they're sort of so puerile. And, you can't actually look at anything real apart from the entities that they take to be ontologically superior or of the highest sort of that should attract the highest moral regard and sort of a normative weight. It's a and at the end of the day, they're just left sort of flabbergasted that well, if you won't let us do this, then what would the plan be? Then they're just sort of cut off from having like a cheap and easy way to think that they're on the right side of history. And this is facilitated also by the fact that they know nothing about reality, essentially. They know nothing about the things that they talk about. They just have these very low grade, low resolution sort of narratives which they call economics, and they call all these other things. Because they're not willing to take responsibility. I mean, it's so easy when you've got a politics which is so bankrupt of responsibility, that effectively, obviously, it's going to generate a very vile kind of pseudo-intellectual or con men elite, and that's what they have, like their and you can see that the speakers that they have and the tenor that they take, it's the same as Hitler. It really is. Even from the Jungian camp, it's interesting. Is these are those personalities. Well, not talking about Hitler in particular, but the contingent of the higher ranks of the Goering and such, and Goebbels what was the there was an INFP as well. But a lot of ENTPs. Anyway, depressing topic.